I'm really excited about the next 45 minutes because I get to ask one of the finest fantasy writers around, and one of my personal favourites, some questions about a wonderful new book, The Magician's Daughter. It's a classic coming-of-age fantasy that shares some of the fantasy sophistication of books like Neil Gaiman's Stardust or C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia. It's filled with old magic, wonder, heartbreak, and it's already been hailed as a classic by many reviewers. An assessment actually that once you read the book, I think you'll agree on. So without further ado, a very warm Newtown Library welcome, Hannah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you about Magician's Daughter's genesis and the creative origins? What were your intentions when you started writing this book, Hannah?
Yeah, so that book, it came about while I was still doing edits on Radical Act, which was, if you've read it, that's quite a dense, big, sprawling historical one with a whole lot of different viewpoints. So I was trying to write something that was, I wanted to write something basically it was a lot simpler, because I wanted to kind of try something different, and going bigger would have started to get crazy. So I wanted to try something that was very smaller in some senses, and it felt simpler and focused more on one person. And I really wanted it, to feel like a fairy tale and to feel something like a classic children's book, but for adults. So that was kind of where I wanted to go with it. Where it came about was basically I had two books I wanted to write. And the first one was really, I was thinking it would be a children's book, which was about a girl growing up on the island of Hy-Brasil. So, which if you probably know already, but so Hy-Brasil's Irish myth about an island that supposedly appears off the west coast of Ireland. It was actually thought to be real for a long time, and it still crops up on maps up to like a few hundred years ago. And supposedly it was only visible every 7 years or so. There were stories about travellers that had washed up on it, and it was supposed to be an island that was filled with black rabbits. There's a castle with a magician in it, and there were all these kind of stories about it. So I wanted to write a story about a young girl who was growing up there, and I hadn't decided at that point what would happen to her or where she came from. And the other side of it was I wanted to write an adult novel that, because this was way back in 2020, and back in 2020 I was rewatching just about every version of Robin Hood you could find, because I was in this whole mode of like, yes, we need to roll from the rich and give to the poor. This is, this is it, yeah. So, which I still am, quite rightly. But, so what I was thinking, I was like, I wanted to do a Robin Hood retelling, and I wanted to do a Robin Hood retelling where instead of stealing money from the rich and giving to the poor, he would steal magic from the rich and give it to the poor, and see where that went. So basically I had those two stories, but in neither one I kind of knew what was going to happen. And then at one point I was kind of like, hang on a second, I have a magician on this island who I haven't come up with yet, and I have a magician over in this story that is being Magician Robin Hood that I haven't got a plot for yet. So what if you two just met each other? And so that's why I got the story, and basically, so Biddy, the main character, is the girl who grew up on Hy-Brasil, but that's kind of became her backstory. And Rowan, who's the magician that raised her, became the one who used to be, who's the Robin Hood character. And they kind of bounced off each other in really interesting ways, and it was kind of, and you kind of ended up working with two English myths that were in a very different vein. So that was a lot of fun.
Biddy, your teenage central character, starts off as possibly an orphan washed up on, as you say, the magical island of Hy-Brasil, and she's subsequently adopted by the mercurial magician Rowan and his familiar H.G.Parry. What were your intentions when creating those two characters? And I'm thinking about the way their relationship interlocks, because they're all connected in very subtle and different ways to each other.
So I think basically with that, because I already had the two, I already had Biddy and Rowan. Hutchincroft, by the way, is his familiar, who's a rabbit, who came along with Hy-Brasil basically, but I loved him. So I think what I really wanted to do with that book, especially because I was kind of wanting it to feel like a children's book that turned into an adult book, what I kind of wanted it to be primarily was a coming of age story about Biddy who's grown up on this island. She's never been to the real world at all. So literally, it's a kind of extreme version of being in childhood where all you have is your books and your games and you know nothing about the outside world, and then go into the outside world and start to learn what it's about and question things that she's previously been told and encounter all these real life things for the first time. And I think what I wanted that to be in terms of her relationship with her guardian was to go from this relationship where he was the only person she knew in the world and she trusts him obviously and not worship, but she loves him and she believes everything he tells her. And then by the end of the book, I wanted them to be relating to each other more as adults and for her to find out all this stuff about him. And the way you do when you're coming of age and you start to see your parents as real people for the first time, and and you start to learn that they're fallible and they have flaws and they have a whole life that happened before you even came into the world, so that by the end you're relating to each other as equals. And that was kind of where I wanted that relationship to go. But yeah, it was, the three of them were so much fun to write.
As you say, they really develop over the course of the book. One of the things that really struck me about the book is the transition point between being an adult and a child is one of the areas that's really heavily explored. What drew you in particular to write about that kind of point in a person's life?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. And I think it was partly, as I say, it was partly that the start was because I had a book that was kind of coming from the angle of being one of the plot lines was a children's plot line, one was an adult plot line, so she was kind of caught in the middle there. But it was also the idea of, once it became about her leaving the island, that kind of worked really well as a way of talking about what happens when you do leave home for the first time, which, most of us unfortunately didn't grow up on magic islands, but there is kind of a time, usually when you're around 16, 17, 18, when you leave home for the first time, and you're out on your own, or if you go to university or go start a job or whatever, and I found that whole period really interesting, because it's that kind of, you're looking back on your childhood and it becomes very nostalgic, but at the same time, you're learning all these new things for the first time that's changing the way you think about it. And that became a really interesting thing to explore.
You mentioned this earlier on, but the magical island of Hy-Brasil is a place I suspect a lot of readers will love and will really want to believe is real. And you said it's actually based on a lot of real stories and myths. Can you tell us a little bit more about the stories and myths that surround Hy-Brasil? Because for a long time, people believed it was a real place.
They did, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's a lot of really interesting books about it. And there's a lot of very weird myths about it as well. That's essentially, I also pulled in a whole lot of other Irish mythology, which ended up being, I'm trying not to give away too much. There's a whole lot of other Irish mythology that ended up being the backstory too, because what I wanted to know about Hy-Brasil was, why was it hidden every 7 years? Where did the black rabbits come from? And, and who lived on it originally, which is all stuff that I kind of ended up drawing on other myths in the course of the book. But it's essentially it. It's supposedly just off the west coast of Ireland. It's been, there's descriptions of it. It crops up on maps. There's traveller stories about it. There's a lot of poems about it that will often, it gets used as metaphors for a lot of things. There's poems about people who, strike out to find it and then, and never get there.
There's a lot of marvellous elements going on in the book. One is the magical traditions of ancient Britain and Ireland, would you say?
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that it's perhaps an element of the Merlin, Arthur, Morgan, Fay triad, Biddy, Raven and Hutch? And can I ask you about the importance of these ancient mythic characters in the book's creation?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, the Arthurian angle. Yeah, I mean, I could, you could definitely see that triangle there. The most explicit Arthurian angle I've got is with Morgane, who's a witch that they meet later in the book. And I'm trying not to explain too much about her, but they meet her for the first time. She's basically, what they find out is that 70, where they're living on the island, I don't think this is too much to give away because they find it out fairly early on. 70 years before the book started, magic started to drain out of the world, and the council, who, of magicians, basically had to try and find a way to deal with this. And so what ended up happening was that somebody, the leader of the council seized power, started to say, well, if all if all this magic is starting to drain out of the world, then basically we can't allow it to drift around to help people's lives. We can't allow it to be used for different, for different purposes. We need to hoard it all ourselves. And so Morgane ends up being a witch who starts out as someone who they think has betrayed them, and maybe she has, but she's someone that is also a woman in a position of power where she's not supposed to be and has had to make a whole lot of difficult choices. And I kind of really wanted to play with that idea of obviously Morgan Le Fay from the Arthurian legends, and whether she's good or bad and where some of her choices might have come from, even though she's not explicitly that character, but I wanted to drift around that. And there's a few things like that in there. And I think, I love rewriting with myth just because, I think when you're writing with fantasy, you kind of are implicitly working with myth, however filtered down that is, because the myths you get are kind of the very early fantasy stories, and they've got tremendous resonance and tremendous power, and they're just very interesting to kind of retell them and think about what you can do with them, how you can change them, what you can use them to talk about. With someone like Morgan Le Fay, it's like, well, how might we look at her differently now than they might have looked at her with the original Arthurian stories, and assume that, it's just an incredibly rich, textured kind of world to draw from.
Yes, I say multifaceted and ambiguous and changes, and ask you about the magic in the magician's daughter. It has many aspects, and I want to talk about several of those aspects. But one key aspect is it's wild and untamable magic. Why did you want to portray magic in that kind of particular, deep, dark green woods way?
I'm glad. That was exactly what I wanted. That was one of the terrific things that happened when I had those two different stories that came together, was that with the original, the Hy-Brasil story, it was automatically came with, that kind of really old, green woods and, dark, deep, mysterious kind of magic. You go back and look at the original myths, and they don't kind of have a magic system the way we kind of try to do in fantasy nowadays as such. They're very weird, things happen, there's different versions of the same events, and I really, really loved that. And that was, especially when I had the Robin Hood story, obviously, to make that work, I had to have a magic that would basically work like a resource, because you start with, how does someone physically steal magic, and how and why do you then distribute it? So, and I think the danger with running with that is that which again, that's what another thing fantasy is really good at, is using magic as a metaphor for something else. But I think if you push too hard into that, sometimes you start to make magic feel very unmagical. And so that's why the magic in the book is essentially that it is this kind of wild, mysterious thing with a will of its own that creeps into the world through cracks from somewhere that they don't understand. But it's also something that, if you're a mage, you can harvest and you can use to make spells and use to make whatever. But I really wanted to make sure that I kept it as something that was, wild and deep and mysterious, and that, in the book is able to, if you just let it go and do what it does, which is what Rowan wants to do a lot of the time, it can sort of creep through and touch people's lives and do unexpected things and make little miracles show up, or, and do all that. So, I really wanted to keep that.
It's time. Can we talk about rabbits now?
Yes.
So, without plot spoiling too much, rabbits do feature in The Magician's Daughter.
Yeah.
And of course, they have long associations with various folk mythologies and magic. But can I ask you, where does your interest in rabbits lie?
Okay, couple of places. So I started with rabbits when I was doing my PhD. I started writing. My PhD was on children's books and classical epic. So among other things, I started writing on Watership Down, which I hadn't read up to that point, because Watership Down is essentially among many other things, it's essentially a retelling of the Aeneid but with rabbits, and it portrays them as they're very connected in that to myth and to, they have myths of their own that get told throughout the book and so forth. So yeah, so I got extremely into this book, which I still am. It's just absolutely incredible. But yeah, so that whole side of it was that I from a storytelling point of view, that's where I got. From the non-storytelling point of view was that shortly after that I moved out to Kapiti, and I was kind of like, well, now I'm on the beach, I want to own some rabbits of my own. So basically, before I was unpacked, I went out and adopted my 2 rabbits that I still have. And yes, and I had done research, but I had possibly not done enough research, and I had, sort of still thought that they were things that you could kind of keep out in the hutch and play with every now and again, and they are not. They are extremely complicated, and they need extremely amount of space. They take a whole lot of care for, which was, which I love. And I also ended up, through them, I ended up volunteering up at the SPCA and working with the rabbits up there. So that was kind of a whole different side to it. So when I was writing them, I really wanted to draw on that kind of mythic side, but I also just, especially with H.G.Parry, I really wanted to make sure he was a rabbit, because I feel like, I don't know how many people who do have pet rabbits, but I feel like they're slightly less understood than dogs and cats are, and they have their own kind of body language and their own kind of quirks, and they're delightful. So I wanted to make sure that there was, a lot of that folkloric stuff was coming in, but also just a lot of that plain, everyday mischievous rabbitness was coming in as well. Yeah.
It's also lovely to books, especially I would say 19th century English canon.
Yes.
Books, libraries, and the Joel feature in general heavily in this book, and of course the unlikely escape of Uriah Heep, and to a lesser extent your other books as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your obsession with books and literature, and in particular how you've woven it into this particular book?
Yeah, obsession with books and literature is almost, I think if you're a writer, you generally are obsessed with books and literature, and definitely, that's how I got here from studying English, I went to school and a university, and basically, that's where it all took off, and especially sort of 19th century and, older. But I think, with this book, what I wanted to do particularly, a couple of different ways, because I really wanted this book to feel like, those kind of older classic children's books in particular, but for adults, but also, those older 19th century books. And the other side to it was that because my main character was growing up on an island, and I said she's never seen the real world, basically her entire understanding of the real world comes from the books she's read. So it was really interesting. So basically it became about going back and looking at what she would have been able to read, because the story's set in 1912, she's 16 when there or somewhere thereabouts when it starts. So basically, what books would she have read over her lifetime, and then thinking about what version of the world she would have built up from that, and how when she goes into the real world, how is that different? How does that inform the way she knows how to interact with people? How does that, what's she expecting, and what does it get? Where does it get you? And so that was a lot of fun, because it was a lot of books that I loved and had read, and it was kind of like, what if this was the only version of the world you knew? Yeah. And the other thing was that I really love about 19th century books that they have so many kind of just plain weird like coincidences, and like Dickens, and why did the 2 characters look the same in Tale of Two Cities, and why does this character always turn out to be related to this very person that he bumped into on the street? And so that's why I kind of wove that into the idea that was the age when there was still magic drifting around, and it was still making weird, quirky things happen. So that's where those things came from. Yeah.
Leading on from that, your descriptions of poorhouse London of the time are particularly vivid, and you mentioned Dickens just there. I was wondering if the inherent drama of that time and place attracted to you as well. I was thinking about A Tale of Two Cities. You know, it was the best of time and the worst of times, but between it was the best of times to the worst of times, there's a lot of drama that can happen in events.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and the idea of it both being both at the same time, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think they say, that quote obviously being from Tale of Two Cities, which is about the French Revolution, which is what I also loved writing about, and also and going all up to the 19th where he was writing it. I think what's so fascinating about that time is just that, say that idea that on the one hand, it's a time when there's so much social reform taking place. There are so many new ideas coming in about how do we treat people, way back to the French Revolution and, being fought over, are people being equal, what rights do we have, etc., and moving into the Victorian times where they start sort of bringing about social reforms and trying to help the poor more and trying to make sure kids go to school. But on the other hand, like you say, it's a time where there's tremendous poverty and tremendous conflict and sort of I think it's a time where it's very much like now, but I think it's a time that you can particularly vividly see our world start to be formed, and the people that are involved in it are making these choices that will lead us to the present day, for better or worse. And so, I do. It is a tremendously interesting time and a very, dramatic one,
Yeah, I mean, like I said, people still believe in magic and spiritualism and stuff like that at that point.
Yeah.
But of course, the Industrial Revolution was continuing to plough its way on.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a really obvious question? The magician's daughters we talked about explores many of the deep themes and roots that you find in classic fantasy. What made you want to write a classic fantasy book in the first place?
I mean, it was partly, because it was 2020 and it was lockdown, and so that was a lot of the books I went back to reading in lockdown. Wasn't so much what I was writing was very kind of dense historical fantasy, which I also loved, but at that time I think I kind of went back to reading those kind of classic stuff. Like I know both fantasy and not, like I reread stuff like The Last Unicorn and The Hobbit and all that, and I also read a whole lot of classic stuff like, I think I read I Capture the Castle many, many times, so yes, and that kind of thing. So it was partly that I kind of, because it was, at that time I was sort of like, well, I want to write something that's like these things that I'm going back to. It's also, that was where I started out studying. I started out studying children's fantasy specifically, and I think specifically books that really straddled children's fantasy and adult fantasy. Like I was, stuff like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and stuff like His Dark Materials and stuff like, The Darkest Rising, and those kind of books that really kind of seem to have a foot in both, and Watch It Down, of course. And I sort of was like, well, I've never actually written one of those before. So, that was what I wanted to have a go at.
The world you create in The Magician's Daughter is really believable, but you have woven magical, mythical elements and historical elements. Can I ask you about world building? How did you go about building a world in this book in particular? And the relationship between those different threads, the mythic thread, the historical thread, the magical thread.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I really love doing that because my background is both in, classics, kind of the English canon, but it's also in fantasy. So I really love finding ways that you can put those two together. But with that particular book, it was kind of, there's the fantastical mythic element, but there's also, when you go into the real world, there's all that kind of historical, the historical element. And basically, the way I kind of wove that one, I think the way you wove that together is because the book's being told from one central character and who's experiencing the whole thing. And what I found really interesting was that for her, the magical stuff is the mundane stuff that she's grown up with every single day. You know, she grew up literally on a magic island, so for her that's all commonplace. Whereas when you go out into the real world, the stuff that we think of the mundane stuff, the streets and the poor houses and London and all that, to her that is the stuff that she's never encountered before, that seems very strange and unfamiliar. So I think that was how she kind of grounded that in a way, because, to her, she brought that kind of like acceptance of the magical stuff, but also that kind of like strangeness of the historical stuff. So hopefully it all comes together as something that she's experiencing.
I haven't really considered about it. Yeah. It's like the mirror. Her past is the magical stuff, and the everything stuff is that's. Yeah. The title, I believe, is a variation on The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. Yeah. I just asked you about that.
It is, yeah. I think you're one of the only people that's ever caught that. So thanks. So I say basically it was just kind of a nod to the fact that I wanted to write something that was in the Narnia vein, and I think I kind of went back to Magician's Nephew a few times quite a bit, because first of all, it's the only Narnian book that's actually technically historical fantasy, because it's set in 1900 while just being written, a lot later. And it had that same thing I was looking for, in that the gaps between the worlds are very porous, which again was something that I wanted to bring in. It's got magical things coming into sort of 19th century, 1900s London. It's got that kind of mysteriousness, I think, that numinous kind of quality a lot, but what happens in that book. So yeah, it was something I wanted to kind of make a slight reference to.
I'm going to ask you another question about the nature of the magic in the book. In one sense, I think you use magic in this book as a metaphor for love. Not romantic love, but the kind of love that seeps into people's lives and communities. It's like good. Do you agree that's a fair analysis of it? And if so, was that your intention, that magic was like a metaphor for love?
Yeah, not so much, I think. I think that's definitely fair. I think what I was thinking of was basically, yes, but what I was thinking of essentially was that, it was because it was set in a time when, basically where magic fading out of the world kind of coincides, as we were talking about earlier, with the Industrial Revolution, and with things becoming more mechanized, and with things, the world, saying not to romanticize the time before the Industrial Revolution, which was also very harsh, but it was a different kind of harshness, and 19th century capitalism was kind of on the rise, and so forth. So yes, so there's a kind of lessening of magic in the world. But I think definitely it's the idea of magic in the book is, and the idea that I didn't want it to be something that would come in and solve everything. I wanted it to be something that would just offer, I think, the possibility of something better, that would have these kind of tiny little acts of, of miracles, of happiness, of chance. And so, I think the idea that the characters can come in and they can just kind of, bring a little bit of humanity back into the world, and bring a little bit, and just kind of do little small things that can make just things a little better in this big, scary world. Yeah, definitely, I think that works really well.
One of the many things I love about the book is how you let small spaces and small details in the book come alive without slowing the plot down, and they really establish a sense of place and atmosphere and character. Can you talk to us a little bit about creating that kind of atmosphere through space and those quieter observed moments so people would have to toast?
Yes, it's a lot of toast, And again, I think I didn't think about it until a second, but I think I got that a lot from Studio Ghibli films, which I was watching at the time, and they're really good at, they're renowned for that, they're renowned for those kind of, I'm thinking that there's the idea, right, of the clap, and it's the quiet moment between the clap that makes them louder. So yes, the idea of like, having those little moments where people are cooking, or people are reading a book under the tree, and you can just breathe and take it in for a minute. And I will say, and that kind of, I wanted that in the spaces like Hy-Brasil, because I wanted that to feel very home-like and familiar, as opposed to some of the intense bits later on, where obviously those moments don't happen. So yeah.
Mentioned at the beginning that you watched a lot of Robin Hood in the research. I was wondering if there's a particular version that had an impact on the book, because there's a lot of Robin Hood out there. There's a Disney version, there's a version with Sean Connery's son Jason, all sorts of ones. Was there one particularly?
It was two. It was, first of all, it was Rowan of Sherwood from the 1980s, which is the TV show. Yeah. So yeah, that I think, which is absolutely brilliant. It's probably one of the best versions I've ever done. And definitely a lot of the Greenwood stuff and a lot of the mysticism and a lot of that quality I think I brought in from that. And the other one was BBC Robin Hood 2006. Which I love. I love that one for a whole lot of reasons, mostly because that was the one I grew up with. But I think I brought So I wanted it again. It has like that kind of adventuring quality that I love. It also really has. I think that one and it is again. So if you've seen it, there's a lot of craziness in that, and I love it. But it also really zeroes in on the idea that they say, that everything is a choice, and that's what that thing. And I think that idea of how do you respond when you find yourself in a dystopian kind of setting. Do you play along and hope for the best? Do you make a stand against it? What do you have the power to do there? And I really love that. And hopefully that kind of worked its way in as well.
Can I ask about the locations in the book? I mean, you go to the coast of Ireland, you go to London. What made you pick those locations in particular? Was there something in your research or just an interest in the places at those times? Yeah,
a bit of both. I mean, apart from the fact that it was 2020 and I was supposed to go to London and Galway that year and I didn't get there. But yeah. So yeah, you could tell. But no, I got to Ireland obviously via Hy-Brasil. That was where I was really interested in, and Rowan ended up obviously being specifically from the Aran Islands, but because of his relationship to Hy-Brasil. But and because of that, obviously, I was really interested in the relationship between Ireland and England at that time and throughout history, which is very complex and confrontational, and so that. The idea of, I wanted to seat the Council of Magicians in London because that's where, the power in the English Empire was seated. And then it sort of became about, well, what would it have been like for Rowan as, being Irish and coming to London or, to England to try and make his name in the council at that time. And that kind of, what would his feelings be about both, how would you feel about trying to work yourself into that system when it's a system that's, obviously got a very a very confrontational, very dark relationship with the place that you come from. And that was something I was really interested in.
The book offers a very different take on the nature of magic and of families. Was it important to you to offer a very different family dynamic in the book?
Yeah, I love writing about families. They're probably my favourites to write. For so many reasons. Partly I think, with the idea, because the idea of families as adults too really interests me, because the idea, I think you see a lot of books where you have adult main characters where they came from, where they've grown up and they don't really see their family anymore. They kind of work, but in reality, and sometimes you don't, obviously, but in reality, I think you generally retain some kind of relationship with your family as adults, or at the very least, you've come from some kind of, complicated relationship that's still influencing you to a certain extent. So I do really love playing with that. But those three in particular, I really loved having the idea of basically, it's a young girl, a magician, and a rabbit, essentially, but which is an unconventional kind of family. But the idea that it's that found family thing, the idea that they can still be a family, even though it's a very complicated kind of relationship, and it's something that I say where Biddy comes from becomes a lot more complicated as she gets on. But yeah, definitely, I wanted to sort of ground it in the fact that they do love each other, and they have all grown up together, and her sense of identity is incredibly shaped by the two of them, for better or worse. So yeah, definitely.
One of the many things I love about the book is the craftsmanship of the way you construct sentences and your use of words. And I was thinking, how do you as a writer go about developing that sort of craftsmanship to write?
It's basically just reading a lot of, well, for me anyway, it was basically just from reading a lot of books. I mean, I didn't, I studied at university, but I never studied writing at university. I only studied books at university, or, literature at university. So yeah, that was basically, for me, it came from reading a lot of books very closely and looking at how they craft certain things. And like quite often, when I'm writing, if there's certain books that I'm in the, trying to write in the wheelhouse of, I'll go back and sort of look at scenes and be like, how did they create that particular scene? What amazed me reading this was that I would go back to stuff like C.S. Lewis or, things like that, and how kind of really simple it was. Like you have these really, with children's books, you have these incredibly vivid pictures of them, but you go back and that description isn't necessarily there. It's just how they've managed to evoke it,
It unlocks your imagination.
Exactly, yeah. So how that happened was really interesting, yeah. So that's basically it. It's like it's reading a lot of books you love, and then going back and going, how did they achieve that particular scene, or how that particular effect that I was aiming for? And it's often, it is often quite surprising, because I think you come away from a book sort of with pictures rather than, or at least an impression of the story rather than the words. But when you actually go back, it's really interesting.
I think that all of your novels are very different. But I also think I can detect a distinctive H.G.Parry style. And so I wonder if I could put you on the spot and ask you, how would you describe the H.G.Parry style?
So I write about stuff that I like. But no, I don't know. I know it's usually the idea of, say, something, something like, either history or literature and that, but then what happens when you add magic to it is kind of where I start from. It's usually kind of character driven and dialogue heavy, just because that's what I like reading, but it's also where I start writing tends to be, who are the characters, and, I fill a page up full of conversation to see, and that's where the plot will come from. It's usually kind of character driven, it's usually kind of dialogue heavy. It's usually, hopefully, kind of taking something that's there and just seeing what adding magic does and using it as a way to kind of bring out or talk about things that are already there. Hopefully it's something that's got some degree of adventure and some degree of thought-provokingness, and will have people that you fall in love with.
We've talked about how the book is really classical fantasy, and it reminded me a lot of the childhood classical reading, Susan Cooper books and stuff like that. I was wondering, why do you think people have such a strong nostalgia for books of that classical fantasy nature?
So good. But yeah, definitely. I think too, and that's one reason I wanted to have Biddy literally grow up on a magic island, because I sort of feel like that's when you think back to childhood. That's obviously depending on the kind of childhood you have, but when you think about the sort of happy feelings of childhood, that's the kind of image you have. And I don't know, definitely, I think with childhood books, you do get incredibly nostalgic about them, because that was the first time, it's the very, it's difficult. I think with adult books, it's hard to kind of replicate the impact of childhood books, because you're coming to childhood books, you've never heard that story before, you've never encountered it before, you've never encountered that particular myth before. Like the first sort of version of a myth you hear is always the one you think of, no matter how much you go on and study others. And, let's say the first Robin Hood you meet is always Robin Hood, and the first King Arthur you meet is always King Arthur, so it's the first time you ever see them, and it's going to shape how you think about these things for the rest of your life. And I do think there's kind of when you think back to the things you're reading, I do think they get sort of muddled up in your head sometimes with your own memories of being a child. Like, you know, you can kind of think back to reading Narnia and you kind of really feel as if you were there.
Yes, you visited that location. Can I ask you a general question about how you develop your characters? Are they based on like total external observation, or do you kind of construct the plot and go, oh, I need a certain villainous character, or a kind of mixture of both?
Yeah, usually the main characters, they come first. So they're the ones that, so I'd say, like with this case, it was definitely the three main characters. You know, with Unlikely Escape, it was definitely the two brothers. Obviously with Shadow Histories, they already existed, so that was a kind of a picking of them. But yeah, usually what happens with the characters is I'll have the main ones that I want to talk about, and I'll have a relationship that I really want to explore. And that's kind of the very first starting point. Like I'll write them talking, and I'll let that relationship come out. And from there, the kind of plot emerges. And usually that's when, at that point, sort of other characters start to get developed based on who you need, you know, to tell the story exactly. But hopefully you make them feel vivid in their own right. But yeah, that's usually it.
Can I end on the very last, very obvious question?
Yeah.
What's next?
Oh, a few things actually, and some that I'd like to talk about. But yeah, the one I'm writing right now is, I think what I can say about it is it's set in the 1920s. It's set at a university for magic, and it's about 4 friends that get together and make a lot of very bad decisions that have a lot of bad consequences for the next few years. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, H.G.Parry.